Welcome to the BudsnReality show. I'm Sean Collins, the guy with a lot to say, and I finally got him on the show, Mr. Anti-war activist and author Scott Horton. How are you doing tonight, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Oh man, this has been it's been a couple months coming. I read enough already while I was laid up from surgery, and it totally blew my mind. It really, really did. I've talked to everybody about this book since I've read it, and I've talked about it on my show multiple times. So
Yeah, I
it's
see
really
you
awesome.
tweeting about it. I really appreciate it, what you said so far. Yeah.
Dude, I don't think you understand the ramifications of what you wrote in this book. I feel like it should be taught in high schools and universities across the nation to really show what the hell these guys really do behind the scenes. Because the propaganda that they give us on mainstream media, well, we all know it's bullshit. I mean, at the end of the day. So, I have a couple questions for you before we dig into the book, though. Well, first off, I'm going to tell you how I ended up with the book because it's quite funny, actually.
Okay.
I started the Liberty Book Club with my sponsor, the Infinite Zeal Syndicate. This is his hat. Great dude. You guys should follow him on Twitter.
Yeah, I think we are Twitter buddies. I recognize that logo.
Yeah, that's my guy, man. And he's
Okay.
the show. And anyhow, we started the Liberty Book Club on Twitter where we just share our reads. Whatever we're reading, let's put them out there. Let's spread the message of liberty. That's the deal.
Sure.
And I had ordered some books, and one of them happened to be The Theory of Money and Credit by Ludwig von Mises.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you what, man, I'm 43 years old, and my eyes aren't doing so well anymore. I had to get some actual prescription cheaters because the cheaters at the store aren't good enough anymore. And I couldn't read the book. The font is so small in that von Mises book that I just couldn't do it. I got through about 6 chapters. I'm like, okay, enough already, per se. And I hit my buddy Joel up and I was like, hey, man, how are your eyes? You think you could read this? I said, have you read it yet? He goes, no. I said, okay, I'll send it to you. Let me get your address. He goes, sure. Well, I want to send you something too. And I said, yeah, no problem, man. I said, what are you sending? He goes, the best book on foreign policy ever written. And I said, is that so? And sure enough already showed up in my mail. And once, I can't remember what I was reading. Actually, I know what I was reading. I was reading The Liberty Solution by Derek Wills, which actually is an amazing book. I had him on my show while I was sick after surgery and laid up. And then after that, I read your book. And being a former neocon, Bush supporter at that, this was very damning, and to say the least. Now, George Bush is the reason I'm a libertarian. He is the sole reason why I jumped off that ship and said, I'm done with you guys. I'm never Democrat. I was raised Southern Baptist. Being a Democrat was never meant to be. So that's how I ended up with your book. My God, I read it in about a week and a half. It was seriously amazing, Scott. You did amazing work.
Well, thank you, man. I appreciate that. I kind of have a running theme where, these books are such a pain to write. It takes me a couple of years at a time to do it. And I'm always kind of, grumble, cussing under my breath like Fred Flintstone about how people better like this damn thing for all the effort I'm putting into it. It's a huge investment in time up front, and then kind of keep your fingers crossed that, because there's a lot of books out there, you know what I mean? So, somehow I was able to get people to read a book about Afghanistan. My first book was really chapter 2 of Enough Already, grew into Fool's Errand because I couldn't contain the dang thing. So it turned into its own book about Afghanistan. Then I had to go back and start over again and do Enough Already about all the different wars there. So somehow I was able to get people to read a book with Afghanistan in the title, which I know is a pretty tough ask. And then so Enough Already has done a bit better than that. And, I think probably I could guess, I don't know exactly about you or, who, but I think the average reader probably, if they're kind of more or less interested in Middle East policy, or they've, kind of turned their ear that direction at all, then a lot of what's in there should ring a bell. you know, that there's a lot of things. If I tell you Ronald Reagan backed Saddam Hussein against Iran, you know that. And then if I remind you that, well, he also backed Iran against Saddam, remember Iran-Contra, we sell missiles to the Ayatollah too. You go, yeah, I do remember that too. So it's not like I'm completely blowing the lid off of these stories. Essentially what I'm trying to do, I mean, it's all essentially, you know, all open source history. Everybody already knows if they look, but I'm trying to really fit it all together for you and explain why it is that when Ronald Reagan did this, then George Bush did that, which led to Clinton doing this. And because we know all these things kind of in a vacuum, and I'm trying to kind of put it together in one timeline and show. And so I like this joke. I usually don't, you know, talk about my family, but I quote my mom. I made her read it for like proofreading reasons.
Okay.
You know, because I didn't even really have a professional editor on this one. I was in such a hurry. So I just gave it to 10 friends to read, and including my mom. And she laughed and told me that she quit counting after we changed sides 10 times. And she was like, after that, I couldn't remember if I was on 11 or 12. So I just said, oh, screw it. But, you know, that's basically the story of the book, you know?
You know, it's kind of funny that you say that, because there's another name I came up with for this book that you could have named it, and that's Sleeping with the Enemy. You could have totally got this book Sleeping with the Enemy. And we'll get into that when we actually dig in. But you kind of brought up all your, you know, how long it took and whatnot now to write this book. And that's one of the things I want to ask you. Between all your research, because you did a shit ton of research for this, you had to have. There's all kinds of facts and dates and names, and I don't even try to say the names in this book because I will sabotage them. You know, like, there's no way. I just kind of pretended I knew what I was talking about when I was reading it, because some of those, you know, names from over there, like what, you know. But anyways, from start to finish, from your research, from starting research to getting into writing to finishing to publishing, how long did it take to get this book out?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I've been essentially researching it all along, just like with the Afghanistan book. I essentially already knew what I wanted to say. I just kind of marked my 20th anniversary of my interview show. And I really started the interview show right at the time of the sacking of Baghdad in, you know, right this time, 2003. It was April 2003. So I've spent this whole time ever since then focusing mostly on the Middle East, but also on European stuff too. So, you know, like the entire controversy going on with Russia, with NATO expansion and all this, the coups in Kyrgyzstan and Georgia and all these things, you know, I've kind of covered all of this stuff all along. And so when it comes to sit down and write the book, I know what my topics are. I just got to figure out exactly how to phrase the thing. So the real answer is 20 years is how long it took. And, you know, including, you know, most of the research comes from, you know, preparing for the show all these years. You know, I got 6,000 interviews.
Wow.
So, but then the story of the book is that Tom Woods called me. See, I've had friends, especially I should shout out my friend Cornbread, had told me for years and years and years that you got to write a book, man. Why are you not writing a book? And I never quite was sure the form of the thing. Like, what all do I want to tackle? What's my point? How am I going to fit it between two covers? I don't know what to bite off to chew here. And then Tom Woods called me and said, hey, let's do a book together that's the war on terrorism for dummies. And we just do a little bit on each of the wars. And I said, bet. He took his daughter to lunch. And by the time he was done with lunch in an hour and a half, less than that, I had an outline. After like 1 hour, I had sent him an outline. I'm like texting him, did you get that or what? He's still eating. I mean, I had done an outline of the whole book. Here's what we're going to say about all the wars: Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, and whatever. It's all in there. Pakistan. And here's the point, you know, the major points and what have you. And then the thing is about Tom is he has a lot of daughters and a lot of jobs. And so he just essentially was too busy. And I guess it was about a year after that, the beginning of 2016 was when I started to write it. I quit doing my live radio show and decided to focus on the book. And then I'm not sure at what point, how far into it was I? It must have been the summer of, or maybe right around this time, like the summer of 16, after the first few months of the book, that I realized, I don't know when it was, honestly. It might have been sometime in the summer of 2016. I realized this book is going to be about Afghanistan. So what happened was the torture section of the Afghanistan section was its own huge section. It was like 20,000 words. And the Afghanistan chapter was now 50,000 words. And I was like, bro, what am I going to do? Because I still have so many wars to cover. But like, if I'm going to bring up torture, I got to talk about the CIA torture, and then I got to talk about the military torture, which that means I got to talk about Iraq and Afghanistan and Guantanamo and the black sites and the thing and the whatever, and, you know, the legalities and the different lawyers and the guilt and the memos and the thing. And like, it's all of a sudden, it's a pretty robust little thing. And my Afghanistan chapter is now out of control. And I haven't even begun to talk about what at that time was already a 16-year-long war and all of the stuff that had been going on in the thing. And so I shouldn't say I hadn't begun to, but I had begun to, but there was so much left to cover still. And I just said, there's just no way I'm going to fit this in a chapter. It's going to be a huge chapter before we even get to Iraq War II, before we even get to, you know, the heart of the stories in the Arab world, not in Afghanistan. You know, it's George W. Bush kicking over Iraq is the story that everybody wants to hear on the other side of Persia from this thing. So I just decided, well, screw it. I'm just going to finish Afghanistan. And I guess if I make the best case I can against the Afghan war, well, that kind of covers the rest of them too. Because if you can't back up the Afghan war, then how in the hell can you stand for what we did to Libya and Syria and the rest of this stuff, you know? So I finished. It took me another year after that. It took me, you know, I really wanted it to get out in time for that election campaign, and that was no way. And I ended up, once Trump was sworn in, I finished it in April on the anniversary, actually, the first radio show, on April the 12th was when I finished the book. And then at that point, Trump had been in power for just a couple of months, and they were badgering the hell out of him to escalate the war. And he was saying, no, I don't want to. Or at least was dragging ass on it. He wasn't speaking publicly about it, but he was putting them off. And they said, well, we're going to get a review now. We're going to sandbag him now. We're going to try to force him this. We're going to make him announce it before we go to Europe for the NATO summit. And then, well, that didn't work, but we're going to make him announce it when we get back from the NATO summit. So as I was putting the final edits on the book, Trump was kind of kicking the can down the road, trying not to decide yet. And then really when the book was all the way done, you know, being edited to all the way to hell and back, was in, you know, by August of 17 was right at the time where he was finally giving in to them, which is what he did. He sent 10,000 more troops and ordered 10,000 more airstrikes in a massive escalation of the war. Well, not that massive, but yeah, I mean, he sent the Marines back to Helmand and the Green Berets back to Nangarhar and put the airstrikes back up. So it was a big deal. And so then the book came out like in real time. In fact, the Afghanistan book ended with the very first versions, people who had the very, very first versions of Fool's Errand. It says, any day now, Trump is going to decide to escalate the war, and he's going to give them 10,000 troops and whatever, probably thing. And then 5 days later, 4 days later, I updated it. And I already had marked in the book, in the text, there are 5 places where I had to change future tense to past tense and say, instead of Trump's about to do this, Trump just did it. And then re-uploaded the text. And then people were reading the book going, holy crap, this book is current as of 3 days ago or 4 days ago. I'm like, yeah, sorry, but you know. And then it took me a while. I'm sorry, I forget. It took me a while to get my ass back in gear to do the rest of the book, where I restored a bunch of sections I had cut out of chapter 1 about the Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, and Iraq War I. All that had got cut to the floor. And then, and see what happened. I left out a part. The thing started as or, you know, kind of one version of it was I did a presentation for Renegade University where it was like, do your worst, take as long as possible. So what happened was I had written up this giant outline. I guess I gave the same outline that I had written up for the book for Tom, I guess. And I sent it to AJ Van Slyke, who's the Renegade University guy. And AJ built this beautiful PowerPoint presentation out of the whole thing. Then I gave what turned out to be, I think, like a 5.5 or 6 hour long video presentation of that outline of what was supposed to be the book. Then my wonderful friend Joanne from Australia, she transcribed that entire damn thing
Oh, wow.
and turned it into Enough Already. And then I had to go back and basically edit the hell out of it and add a bunch to it, obviously, you know, but and turn that into the book. So it was really, the book was the transcript of a presentation I gave based on the outline of the book I'd never written. And so that, and then I just had to go through and really edit the hell out of the thing and get it ready to write. So I don't know. I don't know if there's any that's really interesting or whatever. That's how these things came to be.
I mean, that's pretty cool. It came out, came from a presentation that you did. That's kind of shocking to me, actually, just because I thought you were just there, just writing, man, and it was all from.
Well, there's a lot of that, I promise, but it does. Right now I'm writing a book about the origins of the second Cold War with Russia that we're in right now, and it's already more than 750 pages.
I can't wait till that comes
totally
out.
Out of control.
Me and Infinite Zeal are impatiently waiting for that to drop.
Yeah, it ain't gonna be it. Look, if I'm really, really lucky, I'll have it for you by Christmas. But I really don't know, man. Like the Afghanistan book. And I guess the same for Enough Already too. I hadn't really thought that much about it, but just for example, I can say about Fool's Errand, it's done. Like if you read chapter 5 of Fool's Errand, there are some places where you're like, yeah, Horton, you already said that. But it's not my fault the war lasted so long. We're talking about the Afghanistan war book.
Yeah.
And so but there are parts of it where it gets a little redundant and you're like looking at your watch going, okay, let me out of here. But it's really, the book is not that long. It's, if you move the footnotes to the back, Fool's Errand is only 250 pages. But I made my point already. It's kind of time to let you off the hook. And I don't really have any regrets of like anything that I left out. I don't feel like, I really wish I had a section about Herat out west or something like that in the Afghanistan book. It's fully cooked and done, over now. This Russia book, I can't wrap up. It's just too damn much.
Because they keep giving you shit to write about.
Well, that's one thing of it, right? But that's really only a small part of it. I mean, one thing is, I just, started out as a speech too. It was a speech I wrote in one night. It was an hour-long speech that I gave in 2020 to the King County Libertarian Party in Washington. And then 2 years later, when the war came, I expanded it and it became a 2-hour speech. And I gave that, people can watch the video of that. It's a speech that I gave for the Libertarian Party in Utah. And it's at antiwar.com/Scott. And it's called The History Behind the Russia-Ukraine Conflict. And it's a 2-hour speech and it's, this big long thing. So what I was going to do is I was just going to add a little bit to that and put it on out. And it was going to be this short little awesome book about how America started this war and how it's all America's fault and blah, 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 like always. But then, I don't know, Ben Abelow put out a book like that pretty quickly. And I just got bogged down. I got 1 trillion tabs open and I just can't quit writing the damn thing. And I just, the writ that I prepared for myself here was every single thing that H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, W. Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden did wrong. And John McCain and Victoria Nuland. But that's, so it's, I don't know. I guess when I wrote Enough Already, I was absolutely just bound for whatever reason. I just chose that I was bound to the Tom Woods rule that I have to keep it at 300 pages. Nobody's going to read if it's more than 300 pages. You got to keep it at 300 pages. So as I wrote it and went through it, I made sacrifices and choices about what topics to cover and what was going to have to get skipped in order to keep it within that limit. And I did. It's like 310 or something. It's fine. But with this one, it's just so once I blew past 400 and then it's like, man, I haven't even gotten to MH17 yet. And I haven't even, you know what I mean? Like there's just so much stuff to cover. And Bill Clinton, just to get out of the 1990s is, and for some reason, for example, in Enough Already and in Fool's Errand, I mention in there, it gets like a page is Bill Clinton was backing the Bin Laden night terrorists
Yes.
throughout the 1990s, even
Yes.
while they were attacking us. And
Yes.
we're going to talk about that in a minute, I guess. But in Enough Already and Fool's Errand, that just gets like a page. I go, yeah, he backed the bad guys in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya. But in the new book, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya each get their own section. Where I go, oh, he backed
Yes.
the terrorists, all right. And instead of just giving you some footnotes, I show you. But
Okay.
so I do that for everything. I do that with I don't say, look, Chubby Bush did these color-coded revolutions. I show you there's a whole section on the Rose Revolution, a whole section on the Orange Revolution, a whole section on the Tulip Revolution, a whole section on the Denim Revolution and the thing. And like, so I got a little carried away, man. I don't know.
I'm really looking forward to Provoked. Really, now I don't want to get too much into that book because it's not out yet, but like, your work on foreign policy is second to none, honestly. So I had never heard of you before this book, and then I read this book, and now I've gotten on your YouTube channel, and I've dug deep into your YouTube channel, and there's nobody doing what you're doing. No one. It's not even close. And
Well, no, there's some good people out there. I do appreciate that, though. I'll tell you what, as far as the YouTube channel, I've kind of rumored this around a little bit, but I'll go ahead and tell you guys it. Sign up for the YouTube channel. I got a special project that I've been working on that's going to hit, I guess, probably in a couple days. I got to give it to my Substack and Patreon subscribers first. But I got a thing that you guys are going to want to probably listen to. So,
I'm looking forward to that.
That
You told us. Where did this, I don't want to call it an obsession. Where did this interest in foreign policy come from?
In the 1990s, I was really impressed by the evil of H.W. Bush. Like, I was for the Iraq War I, but only like in a 15-year-old way that I just wanted to see some explosions and stuff. And I didn't give a damn about Iraqis or whatever, because that's just a stupid kid. But I didn't trust the Republicans. And I knew I remember talking with my dad about this. I was immediately very suspicious that they weren't going to the Congress and getting a declaration of war to do Iraq War I. And Bush Sr. was citing the United Nations and saying it's the New World Order where now America enforces the UN law. And he even said, if I don't get authorization even from Congress, which is sort of a half-assed declaration of war where Congress delegates their authority to the president to decide. He said, even without one of those, I'm going anyway, because I've got the UN instead. So that was like the birth of my New World Order kookdom, where I wrongly really believed that the plan was for America to really build a world federal government under the UN, destroy the last of the rogue states that refused to comply, and then that we'd be last and they'd build this real world government. And that wasn't really right. The kernel of truth in it was that there was talk throughout the 1990s of bringing Russia into NATO. So that fit with my whole conspiracy theory that this would be the one world white army of the North that enforces the UN law. NATO would be the army that enforces the UN law against, China and then Islamic South Asia and whoever else gets out of line. And the reality is the Americans weren't about to share all of their power with the Russians. The Germans just let us call the shots. The British let us call the shots. If we're going to bring Russia into NATO, they're going to have a say. And the Americans are just, hell no, we rather build NATO up at their expense and use them as the reason for NATO's existence rather than bring them into it. So my New World Order thing was wrong, but that was really what got me interested in foreign policy overall in the first place. So I was reading a lot of revisionist kind of right-wing authors, like the John Birch Society kind of guys who are, conspiracists. They're not really that far right, but they're just very anti-government and very they're conspiracy oriented and therefore severely distrust federal power. Then I also was reading a lot of Noam Chomsky and, left-wing anti-imperialist type writers too, who had a hell of a lot of good information about their particular topics. And then, I'm from Austin, so I guess I could have become a fascist, but I became a libertarian. I got the best of the left and the right. So I'm for your right to skateboard, smoke weed, and shoot guns and all these things and be at peace. Right. So I just kind of have that libertarian outlook. And then, the Iraq War I was such a ridiculous farce. And once I really learned the truth about how Bush Sr. had and his government had really invited Saddam to go ahead and invade Kuwait, see if we care, and then turned around and stabbed him in the back that way. And then Bill Clinton kept bombing them and bombing them and bombing them for 8 years straight the whole time. And this really bothered me then. The sanctions and the no-fly zones, this was a big deal, along with the absolute mistreatment of the veterans who had Gulf War illness for various reasons, from possibly depleted uranium, but definitely from the anti-sarin pills that they were given, prophylactic pills, and also exposure to sarin and other nerve gases when they detonated the Iraqi chemical weapons stores in the desert in the south of the country at the end of the war, and how they just cover that up. And they say, oh, these guys don't have an illness. They've got a syndrome, and it's all in their head because they're not drinking enough beer and being tough enough guys and whatever, and that kind of thing. So, and then also, you know, I knew that the war on terrorism was coming, and I knew that, you know, I assumed too much. This is not really correct. At the time, I thought that Al-Qaeda was just a front for the CIA, and that all of bin Laden's attacks, including the Khobar Towers and the Africa embassies, that was all CIA plots to just blow stuff up to have an excuse to get us into a war and all that, which was not really true. But it did give me the advantage in that I could see that the war on terrorism is next. And, you know, sooner or later, wink, wink, there's going to be one big successful one is going to get through, and that'll be enough to launch a whole new war in the Middle East. And so, and then I could also tell, I remember telling my math teacher in, I guess it would have been junior year in 1994, as soon as they announced that W. Bush was running for governor, Jeb was already running in Florida, and they announced that Junior was running in Texas. And I said, aha, you see what they're doing? They're making sure that there's a guarantee that at least one of these boys will be a second-term governor in the year 2000, so he can run for president and go back to Iraq. Guarantee it. And that means they're going to throw the election in 96 by running somebody weak against Bill Clinton and guarantee that they get a Bush in there in 2000. And my math teacher was like, yeah. And then what they ran Bob Dole, the crippled old man, against Bill Clinton through the election. And Jeb lost, but W. Bush won for governor because of Ann Richards' horrible gun control. You know, she vetoed the concealed carry law twice. So out she went. Thanks a lot, Ann. You got 1 million people killed, jerk. And so W. Bush came to power. And then, you know, because I was a conspiracy theorist, I was willing to speculate and predict all kinds of things, but because I'm really smart, I got a lot of stuff right, even though kind of my overall framework of the New World Order stuff was not really true. But then, so once W. Bush came to power, it became very clear that this is not about building up the UN, that Dick Cheney's not a one-worlder, that he hates Russia. I don't give a damn about Russia, and they're not inviting, they're not bribing whatever it takes to get Russia, France, and China, especially Russia and France, to vote for and support the war in the UN, which I thought they were going to do. And once they didn't do that, I was like, all right, my whole New World Order thing, where this is going to be a UN war, is just not true. In fact, once they occupied the place, there was one big truck bombing of the UN headquarters in Iraq, and that was all she wrote for that. And so that was the end of me being, oh, and also I started reading Raimondo at antiwar.com. So it was the end of me being a New World Order kook, and the beginning of me just being a libertarian anti-war guy, because Raimondo is this brilliant genius who is the heir of Rothbard and who knew everything about foreign policy and everything about the neoconservatives, who also like Dick Cheney. We're not one-worlders. They're Israel firsters is what they are, you know? So that's the long answer to your question, my interest in all this. And, you know, September 11th was just the way that they exploited it. And I'm not a truther. I don't think that they did it on purpose and all that, but they might as well have. And the cynicism with which they exploited that attack in order to have their way is just absolutely legendary. And frankly, as treasonous as if they had done the attack themselves. That's how bad it was.
Absolutely, man. Well, let's dig in the book, man. We got to go on a history lesson first before we really dig into it, so people understand, you know, this wasn't something that started in the 80s or the 90s. This was actually something that started in the 50s, when in 1953, the United States government overthrew the Shah in Iran. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, they reinstalled him is what they did. They overthrew the democratically elected parliamentary government there and their prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh,
Yes.
and reinstalled the Shah Reza Pahlavi.
Now, but that was a CIA appointee.
Right.
No, to see here, right?
Yep. Well,
So,
look, well, you want me to tell you it?
well, no, but my understanding is at the end of the day, when they did this shit, it was all about British Petroleum.
Well, that was the excuse, right? Was that he was nationalizing the oil, which I don't even think he was really doing. He was just demanding a higher percentage concession because the British were essentially paying nothing to take all the oil. And so that was the excuse for calling him a commie and overthrowing him. And the CIA did it. And of course, they froze out BP and brought in the Rockefellers anyway. You know, it was Amoco that, or whatever the Iranian version of Amoco was, that they brought in to take control of all that. And so, you know, skip a little bit. So there's this giant war in Vietnam, which fails. And at the Nixon pulls the bulk of the force out and ends the war by 73, 74. And now the arms industry is going, yeah, well, who's going to write me a welfare check now? What are we doing next? And they didn't have any wars to fight. And the American people had legendarily what's called the Vietnam Syndrome, which meant that sucked. And we don't want to do that again after Korea and Vietnam. No more of this. So one way that they found to bribe off the military industrial complex was to pour weapons into Iran. And they got the Shah to essentially bankrupt Iran buying American weapons in order to keep the military industrial complex happy, which really helped to undermine his support inside the country. And later came back to bite us because he's, after the revolution, the Iranians are armed all with American weapons. But anyway, so this really helped to destabilize his government during that time. Now, the other legacy of the Vietnam Syndrome is that it really ruined the American policy of containment of communism. And there were some who advocated even for rollback of communism. Whatever we can do to overthrow or weaken communist governments, anywhere we can, we need to be rolling them back. At the very least, we should be containing them and never letting them expand anywhere ever. Well, with the Vietnam Syndrome, they looked at how bad the Vietnam War was for the United States, and they decided, hey, the American people don't want to do this anymore. Maybe we'll turn our policy inside out. And in fact, now we'll bait Russia into making the same mistake we just made and into overexpansion. Now, they didn't want to fight them in Western Germany, but you could bait them into invading Afghanistan. Those people are expendable.
Which is what Carter did, because he started giving Afghanistan weapons and shit.
That's right. He started pouring weapons into Afghanistan in the summer of 1979. The Russians didn't invade till December to prop up their commie regime there. Now, I'm not sure if they really did that in response to the American support, because the first thing they did was murder their own puppet and replace him with a new guy because of what a lousy job the guy was doing. So they may have done that anyway, but the point remains that that was why Carter was pouring the weapons in. It was, as his national security advisor Brzezinski later put it, they were knowingly increasing the chance that the Russians would invade Afghanistan. And I have the document at scotthorton.org/fair use. You can find it, where once they invade in Christmas 79, Brzezinski tells Carter, now we can give them their own Vietnam. They're in the position of suffering their own Vietnam War in Afghanistan. So that was, the policy. The Vietnam Syndrome led to this insight of the end of containment and baiting the Russians into invading to bog them down and bleed them to bankruptcy, right? So this is famously the policy of Ronald Reagan throughout the 1980s that he picked up from Carter there, as, was made famous in Rambo 3 with Sylvester Stallone, where he goes and fights on the side of the Afghans. Now, the other thing that Carter did was there was a revolution in Iran in 79 when the Shah was sick with cancer and had been essentially, there was no one to replace him really in the new government. So the State Department and the CIA advised Carter to go ahead and allow the Ayatollah Khomeini to come home from France, where he was living in exile. And, I remember seeing pictures of him getting on the plane from France and even wondering as a little kid, well, if the French are our friends and we didn't want this to happen, why did our friends let him get on the plane and send him back home to Tehran? And the answer is because they wanted that to happen. And
Yes.
the Ayatollah came in and led this revolution and overthrew the government. And the problem is this, and I guarantee you, if I asked your dad or your Uncle Bob or anybody on your block, they would tell you that the kids, the students rioted and seized the embassy and the hostages during that revolution. But that's not true.
Not
It was
true at
10
all.
months later. Everyone conflates those things together. But what happened was, after the revolution in February of 1979, really through the end of 78, the beginning of 79 was when it was really accomplished. The Carter government was still sucking up to the new Ayatollah's regime. The CIA said, we know this guy. He helped us agitate against Mossadegh back in 53 when he helped to soften up Mossadegh to overthrow him for the Shah. So we know him and his guys, and we think that we can get along with him. It'll be fine, right? That was the advice that they gave Carter. So now Saddam Hussein took power in Iraq, not in a revolution of any kind, but simply in a bloody coup d'etat, where he pushed his predecessor aside, murdered a bunch of guys, and seized power for himself. At this time, I hope I'm not getting too bogged down in the details for you, but at this time, Carter is giving intelligence to Iran, warning them of threats from Saddam Hussein and from the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And they're getting along all through the year until November. And in November, David Rockefeller, the chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank and the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, convinced Jimmy Carter, this is some of my conspiracy theory lore that's true, David Rockefeller convinced Jimmy Carter to allow the Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. And when that happened, the riots broke out because they didn't know that he was doomed anyway, that he was going to die anyway. They thought that this was a real symbol that the Americans are going to do a counter-revolution and overthrow Khomeini and reinstall the Shah. So that was what caused the riot. This is 10 months later. That's what caused the riot and the seizing of the hostages and all of that.
Now, let me stop you right here with the hostage situation.
Sure.
Because something very interesting about this hostage situation that I learned from your book and listening to you on YouTube was that Reagan and his camp actually made contact with those people in Iran, telling them to hold those hostages longer to fix this election, to get him elected.
Right. And people can read Robert Perry about that. And there's a brand new story. It's actually not in the book.
That's crazy.
But I did talk about that in the YouTube series that I did on it.
I know I saw it.
Yeah. And there is actually a brand new story that, well, first of all, Robert Perry is the one who proved it. There were suspicions about this for a very long time, but Robert Perry, Parry, is the journalist who did the best on this. But then there's a brand new story by Peter Baker in the New York Times from just a couple of months ago where it's Bill Barnes, is this Texas politician fixer. I remember him from the corruption with the lottery scandal with Governor W. Bush back in the 1990s. I forgot exactly how it was, but it was bribes for this company G-Tech to get the contract to do the lottery and all this stuff. Anyway, that guy, Ben Barnes, admitted he's like dying now. And on his deathbed, he decided to come clean to the New York Times, Peter Baker. He says that he and Governor John Connally, who you'll remember was in the car with Jack Kennedy when he was shot and killed in Dallas, the former governor, who was a Democrat, but was very, right-wing Democrat and was very close to these Republicans, that they together, Barnes and Connally together, traveled around the Middle East, essentially making this deal. I guess Connally was the one doing it and Barnes was helping him. To let it be known to the Iranians that we would really prefer it if they would hold those hostages longer and they'll get a better deal out of us later and all of this. And the holding those hostages really did weaken Carter. And he knew it. Look, from the moment that they were taken in late 79, this was, he's about to enter his election year again, right? 1980 is the election year. So the first thing he does in his State of the Union address is he announces the Carter Doctrine, where he says that essentially the Persian Gulf is an American lake, and we assert total dominance over the region, and that any other nation that tries to encroach on American dominance of the Persian Gulf, read the Soviet Union, then we'll go to nuclear war. He says we consider the Persian Gulf, we would defend it as though it was the United States sovereign territory itself. And this was a warning to the Soviets that they better not invade the newly weakened Iran, even though they're now our enemy state. They're taking our hostages and humiliated us, and we hate Iran. We're actually still like in alliance with them, warning the Russians, if you pick a fight with Iran, you're picking a fight with us. And so as part of that Carter Doctrine, they expanded their alliance with Saudi Arabia and with Qatar and UAE, and started building all of these bases and expanding their military footprint over there to this huge degree. And then they backed Saddam Hussein. Robert Perry showed this too. It was he that found the document that showed where Alexander Haig briefed Ronald Reagan that Mr. Reagan, this is after he's president, I just got back from the Middle East, and I talked to Crown Prince Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, or Fahd, Crown Prince Fahd, who later became King Fahd. I talked to Crown Prince Fahd, and he told me that Jimmy Carter had asked him to give Saddam Hussein the green light to invade Iran. And so, now, people, if this is helpful, maybe pull up a map of the Middle East. I don't know how well people know this geography, but it's all kind of very important. When they say geopolitics, it doesn't just mean, international politics, but it means geography-based politics, who has access to which waterways, and these kinds of things can be everything, right? So this is obviously plays a huge role here. In seeing where the dividing lines are, where the different nations are that we're talking about. So at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, essentially it ends in stalemate. The border basically didn't even change at all, and they just call it quits on both sides. This is at the end of the 1980s. This is like 1989. It took the whole damn decade long. And with America backing Saddam's side and Israel backing Iran the whole time.
Which is actually insane. So Iran and Iraq are at war, and we are backing Iraq, Saddam Hussein. We're giving them money and weapons, and Israel is giving Iran money and weapons. Right. Now, we're supposed to be homies, per se. We're supposed to be tight. We're allies.
Oh, we are. No, and it was all deliberate. It was all very deliberate. And, I got the quotes in the book where they say that when Saddam was starting to pull ahead, they would tell the Israelis to increase support for when Iraq was pulling ahead, they'd tell the Israelis to increase support for Iran. And when Iran was pulling ahead, they would increase support for Iraq and keep it going like that. And then on the hostage deal, in order to get the hostages released, not that this ever worked, but this was the Iran-Contra deal. When Reagan sold missiles to the Ayatollah, he sold them through Israel. He had Israel sell the weapons, and we resupplied the Israelis. They were the cutout to do it. And because they had that pre-existing relationship. And this is important, that the Israelis did not turn on the Ayatollah or the nation of Iran after the revolution. They were perfectly happy to do business with the Ayatollah. They didn't change their position on Iran until 1993. And we'll get to that, back to that in just one second here. Now, so at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, Saddam Hussein is broke. The Saudis, the UAE, and the Kuwaitis are all calling in their loans. And oil is trading at like $10 a barrel. So he's making nothing. He can't pay them back. And insult to injury, the Kuwaitis are slant drilling, or at least overproducing from shared oil wells in the Rumelia oil field right in the border territory between them, and ripping them off. And they're insulting them. The Iraqis are demanding negotiations, and the Kuwaitis keep blowing them off.
Yeah,
they say that, yeah, there's an emergency, they can't go, but then they get caught there dancing in the clubs in Cairo instead. And then at one point, and think about, seriously, if an enemy nation's government was talking like this to us in a serious way, they said, well, maybe if you can't send your money, maybe you just send your war widows. And this is a country that just lost 500,000 men fighting this war against Iran, this horrible World War I style trench warfare catastrophe against Iran. Maybe you just send us your war widows. Like somebody said that to us, that'll get you invaded right there.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
people take that kind of thing absolutely seriously. So this was the background to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And on July 25th, we celebrate April Glaspie Day, July 25th every year. Saddam Hussein summoned the American ambassador, April Glaspie, and she essentially gave him at least a flashing yellow light, if not an outright green light, to invade Kuwait. And she said, the Secretary of State, James Baker, he has emphasized to me, or has instructed me to emphasize to you the instruction that we are not involved in these inter-Arab affairs. And we are not interested in your border dispute with Kuwait. And people can compare the Iraqi version of the notes with finally Bradley Manning and Julian Assange released in 2010, the State Department cable that describes the meeting. And they're pretty damn close in the way that they describe it. And clearly there's a part where she's saying, look, America does not want a war, which could clearly be read as her saying, go ahead and do this. We're not going to have a war with you over it. She's not saying don't invade Kuwait, because that's not going to be a war. That's going to be a one day, one big battle coup de main, which is exactly what it was, right? So, Stephen Walt from Harvard said, boy, that sure sounds like a green light to me, or at least you could definitely understand why the Iraqis would take that as a green light. And then, and I think it was, it's clear because this is in Woodward's book and everything, the commanders, that the National Security Council, we're talking Bush Senior 1990, summer 1990, is beginning of August when Iraq invades Kuwait on August 2nd, or I'm sorry, August 1st, whatever it was. The first war cabinet that they held, they decided that they would warn the Iraqis, you better not invade Saudi Arabia. We're drawing the line at Saudi Arabia. Otherwise, we don't give a damn. And that was the official position of the government. And it wasn't until a few days later when Margaret Thatcher came to town, the prime minister, and she says to H.W. Bush, oh, don't you go wobbly on me now, Bush, in front of a bunch of reporters. In other words, questioning his manhood. And so even though it was the British who had interest there, the Brits had invested in Kuwaiti oil and the Kuwaitis had invested in British debt, that had nothing to do with us. We declared independence from them. What in the hell are we doing here?
Right.
But that was it. And then once Bush said this invasion will not stand, he had no intention of negotiating an end to it. And he he declared will not stand, I think, by, the second week in August. And then the invasion didn't begin. The bombing didn't start until the middle of January. And in fact, I put the book out on the 30th anniversary of the start of that war. But that whole 6 months long, as I demonstrate in the book, they refused to negotiate. They had 10 chances to negotiate.
Yes, they did.
And Saddam Hussein's conditions kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller, leading to non-existent. At the end of the thing, his only restrictions were America had to promise that we would leave the Middle East someday, and the Israelis would have to figure out what to do about Palestine or something someday. In other words, no teeth, no nothing, just essentially meaningless statements on paper. And he would have withdrawn. And they refused to give the slightest inch because they wanted to have the war. Now, everybody remembers Iraq War I. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, like all of us believe, because that's what, I was just a kid when this was going down at that point. I think in 1990, I was 10 years old. So, but I was old enough to know, what was going on and pay attention and stuff like
Sure.
that. I remember like the school doing stuff and plays and shit about all this and support the troops and all that. I remember all this stuff. But the one crazy thing about this is that we were told once it was over, it was over. Like the war was done. That's it. We went in there, we cleaned house, we kicked ass, the Iraqis are put in their place and it's all done. Well, that couldn't have been further from the truth.
Right.
Because Bill Clinton came in there and all he did was drop bombs in Iraq. It wasn't quite as extensive.
Well, wait, now hold that thought for a second, because we're still on H.W. Bush here. So in the aftermath of the war, your audience, people may have seen the movie Three Kings with Marky Mark and George Clooney and Ice Cube, right?
Yes.
And that in that movie, it's a gold heist movie, but the setting is southern Iraq in the aftermath of the war. The Americans are occupying southern Iraq, and H.W. Bush has encouraged the Shiites to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. Now, Iraq, again, pull out a map if you ain't got one. Baghdad's sort of kind of more or less in the middle there. And it's the country, that's the capital, and the country is ruled by, at that time, a 20% Sunni minority. And now the Ba'ath Party, is a one-party dictatorship, secular dictatorship. And there were Shiites and Christians and other groups and Kurds included in the government. It was dominated by the Sunni minority. And so Bush Sr. encouraged the Shiites and the Kurds to rise up and overthrow Sunni Saddam. But then they changed their mind. And this is depicted in that movie as well. The Americans stood back and watched, even though they're occupying the south of the country. They stood back and watched as Saddam, they let him keep enough tanks and helicopters to crush the insurrection. And they killed something like 100,000 people, crushing the insurrection that the Americans had encouraged. Why? The answer is because when Jimmy Carter gave Saddam the green light to invade Iran, well, first of all, see, I skipped this part. I hadn't given this speech in a little while. Why did Saddam want to invade Iran anyway? Saddam was sitting on this Sunni minority dictatorship. Now he's got a revolutionary Shiite government in Iran next door. He's afraid now that the Shiite population of Iraq is going to side with their co-religionists next door against their, ethnic kin and national kin as Arab Iraqis. And so in order to preempt that danger, he's going to conscript them all and force them to fight against Iran rather than risk the fact that they would ally with Iran against him and overthrow him. All right. So that's why he started the war in the damn first place. Yeah. Now, that was back in the Carter days. Now, skip forward a decade. America has finished backing the guy for 10 years to contain that Iranian revolution. Now they've encouraged this Shiite uprising to overthrow him. And they realize, oops, the Iraqis who did choose Iran's side 10 years ago and fled to Iran and fought on Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq war, they're now coming across the border to lead the revolution. So H.W. Bush, who had been Ronald Reagan's vice president, and his men, Colin Powell and James Baker, not Cheney, he had been in the Congress, but the rest of these guys, they had all been in the Reagan government. They personally had just spent 10 years backing Saddam to contain Iran. Now they're importing the Iranian revolution to overthrow Saddam, and they panic and call it off. And they let Saddam kill them all. But now this becomes the excuse to stay, right? Operation with Just Cause, or no, that was something else. That was Panama. Operation Protective Shield or some crap. I'm sorry, it's right on the tip of my tongue, but it was.
Well, there's so many wars, it's hard to keep up. There's been
all the code names. But the point is that they launched these no-fly zones that said Saddam is not allowed to fly or in the south drive, or I guess in the Kurdish north or drive. In these zones, essentially protecting these autonomous zones from Iraqi government control in the north and south of the country, and regularly bombing them on average of every other day at some points anyway, taking out their radar stations and so forth. Never lost a plane the entire time doing it. But they had to keep the bases in Saudi Arabia. Right now, here the Israelis come back into the picture because now it's Bill Clinton's time. He comes in 1993, and he stupidly had said out loud, yeah, we're going to have to figure out how to normalize relations with Iraq.
Yes.
And if he ever meant that, he should have kept it closer to his chest, because once he said that, the Israelis and the Kuwaitis went into gear. The Israelis started pushing through their agent, Martin Indyk, in the United States, who had been with AIPAC and had founded the Washington Institute for Near East Policy to represent Israel's interests in the United States, and who Clinton had hired. They had him push this policy called dual containment, because America had just, remember in the 80s, America and Israel were backing both sides and balancing them against each other. Well, Now America just beat the living shit out of Iraq. So now Iraq in Iraq War I, that is, Desert Storm. So now Iraq is in no position to contain Iran. So now the Israelis are saying, now you, America, has to stay in Saudi Arabia to contain Iran and Iraq both, since we can't balance them against each other anymore, since we've weakened Iraq too much. So, and then the Kuwaitis make up this ridiculous lie that the Iraqis tried to kill George H.W. Bush with a truck bomb in Kuwait in the spring of 1993. And Seymour Hersh proved that that was a bunch of crap. It was just a whiskey smuggling ring that they blew up into this plot because it would ruin the possibility of Clinton warming up relations with Iraq. And, you know, there's even a great Bill Hicks routine about this. They killed 6 innocent people over this alleged assassination attempt against Bush. And Hicks said, you know, we should have assassinated Bush, and said, that's how you do it, towelhead. Don't fuck with us. And he said, and then in that case, if Bush had been the one who had died, then there would have been no loss of innocent life. But anyway, the whole thing was completely fake, but it ruined. You cussed before, so that's why I'm following your lead here.
Oh, dude, I'm Irish Italian. Like,
okay, we're fine.
What we are.
So that ends the idea of rapprochement with Iraq, and Clinton fully buys on to the dual containment policy. Now, the Clintonites thought it was hilarious that Israel hates Iran now. You guys hate Iran now? What did they do? And the answer was nothing. It was just that the Israelis had changed their policy. They had, you know, at the highest strategic level, they had decided, you know, essentially that, I don't know what, they needed an enemy to fight. Iraq was too weak to pretend to be afraid of, but it was Yitzhak. What happened really, I'm sorry, it's too complicated for the time, but Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister, had decided that he wanted to abandon the strategy of the periphery, where you back Turkey, Iran, and Ethiopia in order to keep your closer Arab countries divided. That he wanted to go ahead and make peace with the Arabs, or at least negotiate with the Arabs, but then he needed to divide them and have them afraid of Iran. So, or wait, I don't know what the hell. I got to reread Treaty of Parsi. But anyway, so they decided that they would demonize Iran, for at least in one part, because they need, the quote was, we need new glue for the alliance with the United States. So we're going to demonize Islamic fundamentalism. Never mind if it's Sunni or Shiite or who's in charge of what. We're just going to say radical Islam, Islamic fundamentalism, and that's the enemy, because that could be anybody, right? You'd point at Sunni, secular Sunni Saddam and call him Islamic fundamentalism and start a whole war on that if you want to. We saw him do it. So it was new glue for the alliance with the United States was turning on Iran. And the Americans thought that that was pretty comical at the time because of how cynical and obvious it was. Oh, and see what it was. I know what it was. Treaty of Parsi explains this, that because Yitzhak Rabin wanted to create this sort of pseudo-Palestinian state, he wasn't really going to create a Palestinian state, but sort of something like that before he was assassinated, that for domestic political reasons, he needed to say, look, Iran. And that's why we need to make peace with the Arabs, is because Iran is so dangerous. And so that's why we need to negotiate with the Palestinians, so that way we can get along with the Saudis and the Jordanians and the Egyptians, you know, better and for the long term, to protect from the evil Iranian threat. So that was the change in the policy there. So anyway, point being that this then led to the absolute permanent stationing of those troops, those Air Force airmen and American soldiers on the ground in Saudi Arabia. And this is what turned the Mujahideen that Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan had been backing in Afghanistan against the United States. Now, in that war in the 1980s, it wasn't just the Afghan, like Pashtun insurgent fighters. It was Arab Afghans, was what they were called. The International Islamic Brigades, were thousands, tens of thousands of Arabs traveled to Afghanistan to fight the holy war against the Soviet Union. And of course, it did help to break the back of the Soviet Union and drove them out. And in 1989, and the whole damn empire fell down by the end of 1991. So now they're pissed because bin Laden and his men, they wanted to fight Saddam Hussein and kick him out of Kuwait. But the king of Saudi Arabia chose the white Christian American forces to come and do it instead and occupy not just their land, but their holy land, the Arabian Peninsula, the land of Mecca and Medina, where the religion of Islam was born. So this is, the Alamo times 10 or 100 to them. And we're just not welcome. And bin Laden ended up getting kicked out of the kingdom for denouncing the king for going along with this stuff. So essentially, Egyptian Islamic Jihad mixed with what had been called the Azam group of Saudis mostly who had gone to fight in Afghanistan. These two groups merged together and became Al-Qaeda, and they started attacking the United States. The first attack was they assassinated a rabbi, an Israeli rabbi named Kahane in New York in 1990. And then they did a failed attack in Yemen at the Radisson in 92. The first World Trade Center bombing, which almost succeeded in knocking one tower over into the other at the beginning of 93, was when Clinton had only been in office for a month and a week. And then 2 days later, they raided the Branch Davidians. And so everybody changed the subject to that, 51-day siege and disaster, and took their eye off the ball as far as what was going on with these guys who almost toppled one tower over into the other at midday, which could have killed 30,000 people or 50 or something. And then anyway, they bombed the Americans training the Saudi National Guard in 95. And then all importantly, the Khobar Towers barracks in 1996 and killed 19 American airmen. Now, for political reasons, the Saudi government obviously had their own interests, but Bill Clinton and the FBI under Louis Freeh, they went along with this hoax that bombing had been done by Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah, right? In Saudi Arabia, have this tiny Shiite minority that are ruthlessly persecuted. If you see a headless corpse crucified on the street corner, that was a Shiite who dared poke his head up in the Saudi kingdom, our greatest allies. That's how they treat those people. Anyway, so they just pretended that it was Iran that blew up our airmen at Khobar Towers when they had no motive to do that whatsoever. These guys aren't flying over Iran or, picking a fight with Iran. They're flying against Iraq. And it wasn't Iran. It wasn't Iranian-backed Saudi Hezbollah. It was, which is some tiny group. Right. It was bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed that did that attack. And what they do? They killed 19 American airmen who were stationed there, these white Christian combat forces stationed there to bomb Iraq from those bases, those no-fly zones. And so by telling that lie, they just absolutely deprived the American people of the chance to even discuss what's really going on here and who's motivated to attack us this way. There's some right-wing religious radicals in Saudi Arabia who want us the hell off of their soil. And that message was completely buried under this, blaming it on the country across the Gulf there. Then came the Africa embassy attacks in the summer of 98, and of course the USS Cole in the fall of 2000. And this whole time, as I mentioned, Bill Clinton's still backing these guys. He's backing them in Bosnia, in Kosovo, and in Chechnya. In Bosnia, two of the 9/11 hijackers, the guys that hit the Pentagon, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the major ringleader organizer of the attack, had all fought in Bosnia. That was how they earned their stripes. They were too young to have fought in Afghanistan. They earned their stripes as bin Ladenite terrorists fighting for Bill Clinton and Osama bin Laden in the Bosnia War, in the breakup of Yugoslavia. And then he did the same thing back to Kosovo Liberation Army. Again, bin Ladenite tied, terrorists, but luckily mostly they were drug dealers and criminals rather than suicide bombers. So we got maybe the mild end of Al-Qaeda there. But they were ruthless killers. And then the same thing in Chechnya too. And in Putin's declaration of war, he said, come on, let's be adults about this. We know that you backed the terrorists in Chechnya. I think we've forgotten about that. And that sounds like some crazy conspiracy stuff, but that's the truth. And, imagine if, skipping ahead, but imagine if just in the slightest degree, if the Russians had been backing the Mujahideen fighting the United States in Iraq War II. When our guys were getting suicide bombed and IED'd, we'd have gone to war.
That would have been catastrophic.
Yeah. So, all right. So Clinton we're being attacked by these guys. Clinton's doing nothing about it except continuing to provoke them. And he is continuing to support Israel. This is another major part of the reason for their war against us. And in fact, the lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta, and his co-conspirator, Ramzi bin al-Shibh, they were both engineering students in Hamburg, Germany. And when Shimon Peres, after Rabin was killed, Shimon Peres became prime minister. And he launched a war as part of this same anti-Iranian policy. He launched a war against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and they attacked a UN shelter and killed 106 women and children. And bin Laden, by that time, had been kicked out of Saudi and then kicked out of Sudan and had gone to Afghanistan. And he released his first declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places. Pretty subtle, huh? That's the title. And in there, at the very beginning even, he denounces the Israelis for the massacre in Qana and says, we'll never forget the pictures of the severed arms and heads of the little children that you killed there. And consider this our declaration of war against all Americans everywhere and civilians too and whatever. Well, when Mohammed Atta and Ramzi bin al-Shibh read that, they said, all right, this is our guy. And they went and joined al-Qaeda the next year in 97. They traveled to Afghanistan and began, joined up the planes plot that ended up becoming the September 11th attack. It was motivated by his agreement with bin Laden about American. And think about this, like if I just sat your mama down at the kitchen table, she might not understand for a second that, September 11th happened because America, a bunch of Saudis and Egyptians attacked us because of American support for Israel at war in Lebanon.
Well, I mean,
that's how these things go.
A lot of people don't understand that. And the first person I ever heard say anything like that was in 2008 when Ron Paul was running for president. Yep. When I was seeking for something different. Like I said, I was a Bush supporter, neocon, and I was searching something different. I find this crazy old man talking about ending the Fed and abolishing the federal or the IRS, and I was like, oh my God, this
is great.
So anyhow, they asked the other two candidates, how they felt about the war and 9/11 and stuff. And they said the typical patriotic bullshit, and that the Muslims hate us and they don't like our freedom and blah, blah, blah. And then they get to Ron Paul and he says something along the lines, it's not verbatim. Don't take me verbatim, but he says something along the lines like, what did you expect by meddling in other people's business for decades? And I was like, holy shit, he just said that on live TV. And I was like, yeah, you got my vote, man. You're my guy. And we're changed. We're done.
I love these stories.
Yeah, we're done. I'm done with this shit. I'm done with the Republican Party. I was a young man. I was 28 years old in 2008 when I heard all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I get goosebumps talking about this shit, dude. Because
that's great, man.
Literally,
that's great.
It did. Because I was the pro-war guy. I was the pro-Republican guy. I was a neoconservative. And I was like you brought it up earlier, like we got to go kill the towel heads on the other side of the pond. For what? For what? You know what I'm saying? And then, reading your book and you talk about bin Laden talking about why he wanted to come after us. And it was because of the mass murder of the women and children. And it was because of the fucking sanctions that we put on there. Now, Americans don't understand sanctions all the way through. Now, when, right now they sanction Russia and whatnot. Now they put these sanctions out and you're sticking it to them. You know what I mean? Okay, you might be sticking it to their government, but who you're really sticking it to is the innocent people that are living there that want nothing to do with this. They don't want anything to do with this. And the sanctions alone throughout the 90s against Iraq cost hundreds of thousands of lives just from starvation.
Yeah. Well, look, and they said avowedly, repeatedly, we're trying to make the people of Iraq so desperate that they'll rise up and overthrow Saddam for us. But They had their chance. We encouraged them and then betrayed them and let Saddam crush their insurrection, which in fact goes back to the ridiculousness of having the no-fly zones at all. The insurrection had already been crushed. He wasn't going to kill every last Shiite and Kurd in the country. We had no reason to have this stupid no-fly zone or this embargo at all. Any of this, the protecting from the threat of a guy whose country had already been bombed back into the Stone Age in the First War. And that's why they weren't able to shoot down a single one of our planes in 10 years of this. And yet they just kept on anyway. And now I should stipulate, I guess, why not, that the original UN study that said that 500,000 children had died was fraudulent and ended up being withdrawn. And it really was fraudulent. There was one guy on the study who just every single house that he went to had lost a child or whatever, and really skewed the results. But it was still 300,000. And Richard Garfield did an exhaustive study that showed it was still 300,000. And the point being that it was a credible enough claim that bin Laden just added 100,000 to it. Said 600,000 children had been killed. And this is why they had to go to war against us. That this was the argument, was America's already at war against us by way of our governments and through, all these different policies, through supporting Israel. And so all we can do now is take the fight to them. And as James Bamford said in his great book, A Pretext for War, that he saw himself as Ho Chi Minh, and his job was to drag America into another Vietnam. In other words, another Afghanistan, which was when America was replicating our failure in Vietnam for the Soviets. And bin Laden said, the Reaganites took credit. We helped bring down the USSR. Well, that's what the bin Ladenites thought too. And they said, one, our motive is the Americans back our dictators and kill the Iraqis and kill the Lebanese and the Palestinians and all these things. But the strategy was to bait us into making the same mistake that the Soviets had made, which was replicating our same mistake that we had made in Vietnam, to get bogged down, bled to bankruptcy, fighting an insurgency that cannot be defeated in hostile terrain. And now look at Afghanistan. It is, the size of Texas. It's got mountains like Colorado and deserts like Arizona and California. And it's wild badlands with a warrior culture where people are armed and they've got, like Kenobi, the high ground. They're shooting down from the mountaintops at you. And there was just no way the Americans were going to somehow tame that land. That was the whole point, was in fact, I published an excerpt in there of a letter that bin Laden wrote to Mullah Omar right after the invasion began, where he said, listen, I know you're mad at me now. Sorry, but here's the thing, man. The Americans, they either are going to get whooped right now and have to turn around and leave in a humiliating defeat, which is going to reduce their stature in the world stage and their power and all that, or they're going to leave in 10 years. After we're done bogging them down, bleeding them to bankruptcy, and they end up losing and giving up anyway. So it's one or the other, and either way they lose and are going to be humiliated. Well, he was wrong. It took 20 years to finally get the hell out of there, but he was right. We lost everything, spent trillions of dollars, got absolutely nothing for it, and it remains to be seen the unraveling of the entire empire along the Soviet model, but seems like we're kind of on pace for that. And so that was it. That was the motive. And then that was the strategy. And the Americans fell for it, which is not to say that Bush is innocent. People get mad at me for saying how stupid he was. But the thing is, bin Laden was smart, that he could see that Bush was a cynic, that Bush and his people would ruthlessly exploit whatever crisis he would give them. And that was what he wanted to happen. And so his son, a non-terrorist son, Omar bin Laden, gave an interview to Rolling Stone in 2010, where he said, in the summer of 2000, I was there in Afghanistan at the Lion's Den. And when Bush was elected, and he wanted Bush to win. And then when Bush was elected that fall, he was so happy because he said this is the kind of president he needs. One he can provoke, one who will attack and break the bank. And then he said he would replicate what he had done to the Russians, and he would do it to the Americans too. And so that was W. Bush, was, the bull, and bin Laden's the matador with the red cape. And so, and again, it isn't that Bush was like, boy, I better do the right thing really hard. It's that he had a crisis and he decided immediately to cynically exploit it. I can prove that to you in the fact that his statement on the night of September 11th, he declared a war on terror. Not even terrorism or terrorist groups, but your presumed emotional reaction when something scary happens. That's got to be eradicated before he quits. And he didn't say the words Al-Qaeda, even though they knew Al-Qaeda was going to attack us all summer long. They knew exactly who had done it. Who else did it? Hezbollah? Yeah, right. Everybody knew it was Al-Qaeda who did it. There's nobody else on the planet who would have done it, could have done it. And then in his declaration of war, sort of his statement before the Congress a week later, he claimed that they're terrorists in 60 countries throughout the world. We're going to have to fight them everywhere, forever and ever. It was obviously he was writing himself a writ. He was not declaring a war on Al-Qaeda, the group that attacked us. He was declaring a war on whatever the hell he wanted, and he's going to Baghdad. It was as obvious as could be from the very beginning, right after the thing. They're going to find a way to pin this on Iraq, and they're going to expand the war. Again, as I had predicted in the 1990s, that there was just no way that you're going to have another President Bush risk losing power after only 4 years with Saddam Hussein still in the chair. There's just no way. And I already knew that. And then I saw that son of a bitch, Bill Kristol, say that on TV one time. And I was like, yep, that is just true. And you could see. And then right after September 11th, Kristol and all the neoconservatives at the Project for a New American Century wrote a letter to W. Bush saying, you have to go to Iraq and we'll never let you live it down if you don't. We're full court press here that you have to take the war to Iraq.
Being on the outside looking in, and this is like this war in particular in the whole Bush era, the second Bush era, really sticks out to me because those were my people who went there. I'm 43 years old. You know, I'm the tail end of Gen X. So it was my people and the older millennials that went there. And as a matter of fact, my best friend in the entire world is a 20-year Ranger. He went to Bosnia. He went to Iraq. He went to Afghanistan multiple times. I'm glad he's still here by the grace of God, really. But, I invested a lot into this stuff and I was very pro at first. And then as time went on, I was like, wow, something doesn't add up. But one thing that didn't add up, even when I was for it, was why the hell were we going to Iraq in the first place when we knew bin Laden was over there in Afghanistan, possibly Pakistan? It didn't make any sense.
Okay, so let me do this quick because I'm checking the clock and I'm behind.
I know, me too. I'm like, we got to go.
Okay, so here's what happened. W. Bush needed to prove that he was a tougher and smarter guy than his father, who made the mistake of ending the war too early and was unelected after only one term due to that mistake. And W. Bush was going to prove that, no, you got to be in the middle of a war to guarantee your reelection. You privatize Social Security in your second term. Karl Rove's writ was to get this guy reelected. Dick Cheney was a terrible businessman. And the reason he'd been hired at Halliburton was because he'd been the Secretary of Defense before. And they under H.W. Bush, and they thought he could use his army connections, his military connections to get them a bunch of contracts and make them a bunch of money, which I guess he did to a degree, Camp Bondsteel in Bosnia and all that kind of thing. But he made a terrible decision and bought a company called Dresser Industries right before they were found liable for literally billions of dollars of cancer claims, asbestos cancer claims. So Cheney and his right-hand man, CFO guy, had just completely blown it and had, bought this giant liability for Halliburton. So he had to pay those guys back. Like, I don't know if they threatened to kill him or what, but he absolutely was in hock to the most powerful gangsters in Houston. And so he was determined to become vice president and get us into a war so he could put Halliburton and Kellogg Brown and Root, their subsidiary, on the dole. As simple as that. And he had warned, you can type this in, take the note for later if you haven't seen it. I quoted in the book. Dick Cheney in 1994 was interviewed on C-SPAN and was asked, why didn't we go all the way to Baghdad? And he makes you can tell he was on the right side of this argument in 1990. That he said, look, if we'd done that, the Iranians would dominate the Shiite South, and the Turks would have a problem with independent Kurdistan and might invade, and the Syrians would then dominate in Western Iraq, and our guys would be bogged down fighting an urban combat situation, trying to hunt down Saddam Hussein and then create a new government to replace his. And we just decided, man, how many more American lives is Saddam Hussein worth? And we decided not very many. That was what he says. So he has an absolute, not just like, geez, we didn't want to. He explains exactly why the hell not to go all the way to Baghdad in 1994. That's what changed for him. Then you have Donald Rumsfeld. He'd been the Secretary of Defense before, and he had his own, there was a big kind of competition around that time. It's the transformation of the military in the post-Cold War era, but transformation from what to what? What are we going to do next? And his idea, he had signed on to the group that believed we needed to de-emphasize large combat brigades and emphasize special operations forces and air power. So we can go quick lightning strikes, go in, blast presumably mostly third world governments to bits, and then let the UN or whoever come in and take care of the State Department or whoever come in and take care of the aftermath and build the new government there. And we'd be light and fast and go regime change to regime change to regime change, which was part of the way that he fought the war in Afghanistan, at least at first, was to be sort of supposedly a test of proof of concept for that. And then Iraq was supposed to be, as Wolfowitz put it, doable. It was just like a Lockheed commercial, like a promotional video. And we're going to go in there with all these Lockheed products, and we're just going to smash Saddam Hussein's government to pieces and show how easy it is and how powerful we are, and set this precedent. Is a huge part of his thinking. And then you got the neocons, and this is all in the book. I explain it in detail, and people can read. Actually, my Iraq chapter is on my Substack if people want to look at that, where I explain what's called the clean break. In fact, just type in my name, Scott Horton, and the clean break and Substack, and you'll find that's the title of one of the sub chapters of my Iraq chapter. And explains how the neocons, to put it very quickly here, the neocons believe that if we got rid of Saddam, that would empower either one, the king of Jordan or his cousin, or two, failing that, Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi exile and friend of the neoconservatives, would be in charge of the country, would be put in charge of the country, and they would take control of the Iraqi Shiite clergy, especially the leaders of the Shiite religion in the holy city of Najaf in the south. And they would have those leaders tell Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to stop being friends with Iran. Now, this is some completely harebrained Rube Goldberg scheme type thing, and it didn't work at all, because what happened instead? What happened instead was when W. Bush invaded in 2003, he picked up right where his old man had left off in 1991, and he took that Shiite revolution all the way to Baghdad. And we talk about, your buddy who fought in that war, all of his friends that died in that war, they died fighting on the Shiite side of that civil war. That whole bloody thing for 5 or 8 years, however you count them, the worst part of it was 5 years of civil war, was essentially fighting for the Shiite parties, the ones closest to Iran, the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, the Hakim faction, and the Dawa party, and to kick all the Sunnis out of the capital city. So this is, if you look at the ledger of the American empire in the Middle East here, America's on the Sunni side, not the Shiite side. America backs Saudi and the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. That's the Sunni king of Kuwait and of Bahrain and the emir of Qatar and all the emirs and sultans of the United Arab Emirates and all of that. These are all the Sunnis. Same for Jordan, same for Turkey. The Turks aren't Arabs, but they're Sunnis. And the Israelis are on that side of the ledger, right? Then on the other side of the ledger is Iran, Shiite revolutionary Iran. They're friends in the Ba'athist government in Syria, which is ruled by the Alawite minority, which is sort of kind of a break off of the Shiites and allied closely with the Shiites, and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. So now what did W. Bush do? This stupid cross-eyed idiot. He went in there and he gave Baghdad to Tehran. he added the capital city of Iraq to Iran's side of the ledger. So now instead of it being Tehran, Damascus, and Hezbollah, now it's Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, and Hezbollah. So where the clean breakers thought that they would weaken Iran's influence in Syria and southern Lebanon, they actually just tripled it. They just, completed that so-called land bridge, as they call it, the highway that runs from Tehran through Baghdad all the way through Damascus to Beirut. And Sunni Saddam used to be the roadblock. America got rid of him and made it a 100% Shiite highway all the way through to the Levant. So that's why Barack Obama backed al-Qaeda in Syria. Because I know you were wondering, why is Barack Obama backing al-Qaeda in Syria? Because
it was crazy to me.
It was
I'm
crazy.
glad you brought that up because I was like, what the fuck?
Well, that's the answer. So W. Bush put the Shiites up 2 pegs. So Barack Obama had the mandate to try to at least bring them down 1 peg by getting rid. We gave them Baghdad. Now we got to take Damascus away from them. And that meant then that the bad guys from Iraq War II, when we were fighting for the Shiites against the Sunni insurgency led by al-Qaeda in Iraq, those are now the good guys. We call them moderate rebels, and we're using them against the Shiites who we hate so much in Syria. And this got completely crazy because after 2 years of this, the Islamic State, which was really the Iraqi-dominated faction of al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, decided that they didn't really want to focus on Damascus. They just wanted to consolidate a state in eastern Syria. So they broke off from Syrian al-Qaeda and from the authority of Zawahiri. This is after Osama had been killed. They might not have disobeyed Osama. This is one of the problems with decapitation strikes, is they were like, they would probably do what Osama said, but Zawahiri, meh. And they told him, we don't want to obey you. We want to do what we want. And he said, just keep fighting. And they said, no, we want to create a state now. So, and they were fighting over who controls the oil money, of course. So in 2013, al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, aka the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, created a state. And 1 year after that, in the East, 1 year after that, they rolled right into Western Iraq. And this is the famous images you have in your mind right now, the giant convoy of Toyota pickup trucks with their headlights on rolling into Mosul. We'll all never forget that. They rolled in and they took over all of Western Iraq. See, when W. Bush gave Baghdad to the Shiites, they didn't really want to rule the whole country. They have control, now that they control the capital city and the national government, that means they already control, for geographical reasons, they already control the oil in the south and in the north. And when the Sunnis control the national government, they control the oil. But now that the Sunnis don't control the national government and the Shiites have the government and all the oil, their attitude was the Sunnis can just go burn in the sun out west. We don't give a damn about them. They were men without a country. And so the Shiite Iraqi forces had never truly consolidated control over Western Iraq and northwestern Iraq. So there was really nobody to stop ISIS when they rolled right in and created and, sacked Western Baghdad in June 2014 and created a state now the size of Great Britain that ruled all of Western Iraq and Eastern Syria, which led then to Barack Obama. A few months later, he kind of waited until, they really were begging. And then he launched Iraq War III to help the Iraqi Shiites, who were also being backed outright by Iran at the time, again, to fight the Sunnis. So rewind again now. W. Bush invades, finishes the job that his father started but called off halfway through in leading the Shiite revolution to take over Baghdad. Fights a 5-year war for them to put them in power. Then, regretting that, the American, and Bush and Obama are just interchangeable here. Bush would have done the exact same thing in Obama's position. This was not a partisan difference. In fact, Bush had made the change on the so-called redirection of tilting back toward the Saudis and the Sunnis as early as 2006. And they kind of had to finish up the war as they were going, but they already regretted it during W. Bush. So this is not a Republican Democrat thing. The policy had really already changed before Obama came to town. But then with the Arab Spring, that was their chance to exploit that revolution and to try to get that regime change there. So W. Bush had fought a war for the Shiites in Iraq. So Barack Obama fought a war for the Sunnis in Syria, which blew back into Iraq in the form of this caliphate with this guy Baghdadi, who might as well have been bin Laden himself, up there on the balcony declaring his dictatorship, which meant that we had to then back the Shiites in Iraq again to smash the caliphate that they had built. And in fact, in the book I quote where the Americans and the Iranians both admit that they're working together in the battle for Saddam Hussein's hometown of Tikrit. The Americans are flying air cover for Iranian Quds Force on the ground, retaking Tikrit from the Islamic State Caliphate. And so we skip Libya and Somalia, but, they're along those same lines. And then Yemen is another one where they took the side of the bin Ladenites. Now, Obama famously had a drone war in Yemen. A lot of people think that's the worst thing he ever did was these drone wars. That was nothing, man. He's dropping 50-pound bombs on a pickup truck and killing 5 guys. Who cares about that? I do. I was against it, and I am. But that's nothing compared to what happened. That was from 2009 through 14. But then in 2015, he switched sides in the war. And he then took the side of the Saudis, the UAE, and Al-Qaeda against their enemies, the Houthis, just because they're Shiites and friends with Iran.
Yep.
And so even though our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who was the commander of CENTCOM at the time, the 4-star general commander of CENTCOM at the time, he had been working with the Houthis, passing them intelligence to use to kill Al-Qaeda guys. Barack Obama calls him up, says, we're switching sides in the war. Now we're going to back the Al-Qaeda guys against the Houthis. And we know from Mark Perry that Lloyd Austin was beside himself over this and flipped out, and he wrote a giant letter of protest to Obama that was going to get him fired. And his friends talked him out of sending it, supposedly. And he clicked his heels and committed high treason anyway on Obama's orders. And they launched this absolutely horrible war. And through the, power of plausible deniability, it's American planes, American bombs, American trainers, and some say even American pilots in some circumstances. Certainly American planes refueling, American contractors providing all the care and feeding of the planes and the arming of the missiles and everything else, the logistics just for the air traffic control and everything else is the American back war. But no, it's Saudi princelings flying the planes. So if the Saudi princelings and the UAE princelings go around and bomb the water and the electricity, the sewage, the hospitals, factories and markets and apartment complexes and the fishermen in their boats out in the sea and every other thing in the world. Well, geez, that's just their fault, right? You hear them say this about Ukraine now. We give Ukraine all the weapons in the world. If they decide to strike deep into Russia, or even launch a drone strike on the Kremlin itself, hey, that's their decision. And that's not up to us to overrule something like that, So that's how they approach the war in Yemen. And so the Saudis and the UAE just waged this absolutely, frankly, genocidal war against Yemen, deliberately inflicting a famine.
It's
a full blockade.
It is.
Yeah.
How many people have died? We're talking close to 1 million now.
Well, we don't really know. I bet you, yeah. I think, if you look at ACLED data, I think, their total estimate is somewhere near 500,000. But I guarantee it's more than that. If they ever can do the excess death rate studies and really try to find out, because this is already the poorest country in the Middle East. And the policy was deliberate starvation. They're bombing the farms, bombing the grain silos and the horses in their stables and
all the agriculture,
everything.
All of
it. So
it's insane. And it's the funniest part about this is everybody loved Obama so much. They thought he was this great guy. And he was no better than Bush when it came to war. He
killed at least as many people. That's right.
I think he might be worse than Bush just because of the fact that he killed all those people while wearing his Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah. Well, and look, W. Bush, for all of the horror that he caused and everything, when he turned all of Western Iraq into Al-Qaeda University, that was because he's a big, stupid idiot who listens to a bunch of pro-Israel traitors and follows bad advice. Barack Obama knowingly and absolutely deliberately took bin Laden's side in Libya, Syria, and Yemen. I mean, bin Laden was dead. It's right at the time he killed him. When he killed him May 2nd, 2011, at the exact time that he's taking his men's side in Libya and in Syria. And then shortly in Yemen as well. And it's high treason. There ain't no other way to put it. And I'm not a partisan, man. You hear me up here, absolutely barbecue W. Bush and H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan, this is not, and frankly, like just on a personal level, it's Bill Clinton and W. Bush are the two who I hate the most. Those two are just absolutely the worst. But just for my own kind of personal taste, I guess. But absolutely, Barack Obama, started 5 wars, right? His war in Pakistan also was horrible because they were hunting 29 guys. I swear, I got this from John Kiriakou, the CIA officer, anti-terrorism officer. They were hunting 29 Arabs hiding out somewhere in Pakistan. And they launched this horrible drone war that killed thousands of people. And they made a deal with the Pakistani government that we would back their invasion of the Swat Valley that led to the deaths of like 80,000. Just absolutely was this horrifying war in the federally administered tribal territories of Pakistan. And only because the only reason the Pakistani Taliban was growing in strength was as a reaction to America's drone war, hunting for Arabs, which were, absolutely negligible in number and no harm to us whatsoever, stranded in no man's land on the far side of the planet, as far as you get from here without being on your way back again. No threat to us whatsoever. And then once the drone war really got bad, they went home to where they were from. So they helped spread the jihad back in Libya and Yemen and all the places where they had come in the first place when they had been hiding out with bin Laden. So the war in Pakistan always gets short shrift, but it was absolutely horrible too. There's a new study out from Stephanie Savell at the Cost of War Project and she admits that this is throwing darts a little bit. It's not even exactly excess death rates, but it's, trying very carefully to extrapolate from the different war zones. And she's calculated 4.5 million people who have died from the wars, not necessarily shot to death, but, otherwise deprived to death from the wars. And of course, that's mostly children. We didn't talk about Somalia, but there were 250,000 children had been essentially starved to death by W. Bush and Barack Obama by 2010-11. And that was, famine and drought hit the Horn of Africa, but it was America's war that had completely destroyed Somalia. So where Eritrea and Ethiopia and Kenya, they went hungry, but they survived. In Somalia, they laid down and died. And that means under 5 years old. That's who died, babies and toddlers. And that was a quarter, and that was only in the first major famine under the Somalia war. In 2012, there was another in 17, and there's another hitting right now. And I'll tell you what, let's wrap with this. You can check my work. Morgan Hunter wrote this great piece for antiwar.com a couple of years ago about the Great Locust Plague. And you might remember that there was a big locust plague in East Africa a couple of years ago, decimating crops. And we don't know the excess death rate from that, but it's at least tens or hundreds of thousands. Well, it's all because of America's war in Yemen. They only just finally figured out, I read, what causes grasshoppers to turn into locusts. And what it is and they can go generations and generations without ever turning into locusts. What happens is when their populations get so saturated that all the males' legs rub up against each other, that's what causes them to turn into locusts. That's what triggers the metamorphosis. So in Yemen, I don't know if they had already figured this out exactly or what, or they had intuited that it was something like that. But they had a program at the University of Sana'a, in the capital there, where the graduate students would go out every spring and they would murder the grasshoppers. They would cull the grasshoppers by the, millions, I guess, poison them or burn them or whatever the hell. Well, because of the war, that program ceased. The university was closed down. The graduate students did not do their grasshopper elimination campaign. Well, guess what? They'd turn into a plague of locusts, decimated Yemeni crops, and then crossed the Red Sea and hit the Horn of Africa and wiped out crops in Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. And that's, literal biblical level destruction brought on these helpless, innocent people who never attacked us or dreamed of attacking us in a million years. Again, we're fighting in Yemen on the side of the guys who attacked us there.
Hey.
And killing hundreds of thousands of people. And, again, I bet you when they do a real study of Yemen, you're going to find it was 1 million excess deaths from 2015 through right now. And they're still not quite, the Americans are obstructing final peace efforts in Yemen right now. But I guarantee you it's more than 500,000. I bet you it's more than 750,000 people there. And history is going to never forget that. And this is what the United States of America does in the 21st century. Just go traipsing around, completely destroying nations and populations.
World dominance it is. Mr. Scott Horton, thank you so much for your time, man. I know you got stuff to do, and I really appreciate this time. And ladies and gentlemen, read this book. You have to read this book. I'm telling you, you have to read it because you will understand the significance of foreign policy when you do read it. It's important to all of us. It's not just, hey, we're at another war. I know we've been desensitized to it through the decades because I'm in my 40s. We've been in a conflict my entire life. But it affects everyone. They send our kids to die. It takes our tax dollars. It's taxing on the economy. The economy doesn't get better. It gets worse. It creates inflation. We have to end the wars. Enough already.
You got it. Well, thank you, man, for that great endorsement. I really appreciate it a lot.
Thank you so much, Scott. And until next time, and I hope to get a signed copy of Provoked when it gets here.
Absolutely.
Take care, brother. Thank you so much.
Thank you.